Well, hello there, everybody. Hello, hello. I'm so glad to be able to be here again tonight with you. And if you've been following around with me, we have been reading The Little Riders. And so I thought I would jump on here and read chapter 4 to you. Hope you're enjoying it. Here is the picture from the end of chapter 3 to remind you what was happening. She was putting all of the little riders and horses into burlap sacks and trying to hide them really quick. Do you remember that? Okay, let's see what happens in chapter 4. And here's our picture. Okay. For that one night, the riders were hidden in Grandfather's den under the couch that was now Johanna's bed. The next morning, Grandfather would try to find a place where they could stay hidden until the war was over, someplace far away where no German would think of looking. Johanna went to bed exhausted, but happier than she had been in many weeks. The little riders would be safe. If she reached under her bed, she could feel the curly mane of one of the horses. Outside, the night cleared, the rain stopped, and the wind died down. A few stars appeared, and with them, like more stars, came the lights of airplanes overhead. Their buzzing sound gave Johanna a safe feeling and made her drowsy. Just before she fell asleep, she thought again of her father. He walked toward her, taking long, impatient steps. He lifted her high in the air and said, "Give my very special love to the little riders and help Grandfather take care of them." The next morning after breakfast, Grandfather went to a nearby village where he had a friend who was a farmer. Dirk was one of the few farmers who had been allowed to keep his horse and wagon. Because he delivered eggs and fresh milk several times a week at the house of the German town commander, the German sentries who stood guard at the entrances of the town never searched his wagon. Many times, young men who were hiding from the Germans had left town in Dirk's wagon, hidden underneath the tarp between the empty egg cart boxes and the rattling milk containers. Grandfather and Dirk had often worked together to take such young men to safer places in the country, and Grandfather was sure Dirk would help hide the little riders. Grandfather was gone most of the day. He came back around tea time. Grandmother and Johanna had just started to worry about what might have delayed him when Grandfather entered the house. He was happy and pleased. Everything was going to work out beautifully. Dirk had given him 24 heavy burlap sacks. I guess I gave you a teaser. I forgot that that was in this chapter. Oops. In the course of the evening, Grandfather's friends would come, unseen through the dark, and each would take home a sack with a rider or horse in it. The next morning, they would take the sacks to the small cafe near the edge of town where Dirk always stopped on his way home for a cup of coffee and a game of billiards with his friends. In the small room behind the bar, many people had waited to be taken to safety by Dirk's horse and wagon. The little riders and their horses would wait there now, and they would stay hidden on Dirk's farm until they could return to the church steeple. It was still a few hours before dark. Grandfather and Johanna went upstairs to put the riders and their horses in the burlap sacks so that they could be taken away without delay when the men came. Johanna looked for the last time at the riders' faces. With her hands, she covered their small hands that so many times had lifted their swords in proud salute to one another. The Germans will not get them, she thought. They will always ride over the town, even 100 years from now. It was still light when Johanna and Grandfather finished and went downstairs. Grandmother picked up her knitting at the round table in the living room. Grandfather sucked on an empty pipe, and Johanna leafed through an old magazine. The curfew would start soon, and except for the bark of a dog and the cooing of the doves that nested under the eaves of the church tower, it was quiet outside. Then, from the side street that led to the marketplace, came the sound of marching soldiers. It was unusual for a group of soldiers to be exercising at this late hour. Now that they came nearer, they sounded not so much like a group of soldiers exercising, but more like 8 or 10 soldiers who, by force of habit, marched instead of walking. They came out of the side street into the marketplace. God knows what they are up to, Grandmother said, but it's never good if they come by night. And there are quite a number of them. Grandfather looked out of the window. They never use so many for a simple arrest. But they do if they search a house, Johanna was going to say, but she didn't complete her sentence. One of the soldiers shouted a command and the group stopped still. They were in front of the house. Grandfather stepped quickly back from the window into the dark room. They may have come for something else, he tried to reassure Grandmother and Johanna. The doorbell rang loudly and insistently, and Grandfather went to open the door. Grandmother and Johanna followed him into the hall. 9 soldiers were standing on the doorstep, and one of them was the spokesman. Johanna was so frightened that for the first time since the beginning of the war, she forgot all about her promise and looked the soldier straight in the face. She saw a large man with a big red face and 2 small shiny eyes under shaggy eyebrows. He spoke to Grandfather in heavily accented, but otherwise good Dutch that Johanna could easily understand. We are sent by the town commander to requisition from you the key to the church tower. As he spoke, he looked around with his shiny little eyes. We will take the statues of the riders with us tonight, and you can get the key back afterward at headquarters. Hurry, we don't have all night, he concluded. Grandfather reached up slowly for the big iron key that always hung on a peg near the stairs. He handed the key to the soldier. When they had gone, he closed the door and for a moment leaned heavily against it. Johanna saw small drops of perspiration under his nose and on his forehead. They will be back as soon as they have seen the riders are gone, Grandmother said. We will have to hide them better. There is no time, Grandfather said. They will be back in a few minutes. And where can we hide the riders? No, our only chance is somehow to keep them from going upstairs. If we can tell them something that will make them go away, even if it's only for a short time. Grandfather straightened his shoulders and gave Grandmother and Johanna a sly look. There is only one thing for us to do. We must try to fool them. We'll act very surprised when we hear the riders are gone, and we can even suggest that because they are so old and therefore valuable, they must have been stolen. They will never believe us, Grandmother said. Excuse me. They will certainly be back to investigate, but they might believe us long enough to give us a chance to hide the riders. Grandmother still looked doubtful. Johanna thought, but Grandfather couldn't talk about it further. The soldiers were back. This time they didn't ring the doorbell. Instead, they pounded the stocks of their rifles on the door. The spokesman was hot and red and so angry that he could hardly speak Dutch anymore. He kept lapsing into heavy German shouts that Johanna couldn't understand. The riders may have been stolen, Grandfather's deep, quiet voice tried to interrupt the angry flow of words. We all know that they are very valuable. The big red soldier made so much noise that Johanna didn't think he had heard one word of what Grandfather had said. But now he started to laugh loudly. Sneering, he turned to the other soldiers and mimicked Grandfather. He thinks they may have been stolen because they are so valuable. And all the soldiers roared with laughter. Suddenly, the big soldier turned again toward Grandfather, and he was not laughing now. You old liar, he barked. For a moment, Johanna thought that he was going to hit Grandfather, but Grandfather went on talking as if he had not heard him. Take me with you to the church tower, and I will show you where I left the riders when I saw them last. I never saw them again after I closed the little doors the night the town commander gave us the order to do so. Grandfather spoke so convincingly that Johanna was almost ready to believe that the riders were now in the possession of some clever thief instead of upstairs in the den under her own bed. But the big soldier didn't care what Grandfather said. He turned his back to him and gave his orders to the other soldiers. The old man and the old woman will come with us to headquarters. The town commander can conduct the hearing himself. If he orders so, we will search the house later. We will not leave a thing unturned, and if those riders are hidden here," he said, shrugging his shoulders in disgust, "we will find them, and these people will learn what happens to those who dare defy an order given by a German officer." He looked at Johanna. "The child can stay," he said, but he didn't let Johanna kiss grandfather and grandmother goodbye. Johanna was standing near the hall closet, and quickly she slipped down a coat for grandmother, but she couldn't get grandfather's coat off the hook. The coat was heavy and the hook too high, and now they were leaving. She could give grandfather only his hat and his woolen scarf, which weren't enough for the chilly September night. Grandfather and grandmother walked arm in arm out of the door, and the soldiers followed them. When the last soldier slammed the door behind him, Johanna found that her knees were shaking. She had to sit down on the bottom step of the staircase. The clock in the hall ticked, and the minutes passed by. "If those riders are hidden here, these people will learn what happens to those who dare defy an order given by a German officer," the soldier had said. They must be hidden more safely, Johanna knew, and she would have to do it. The men would certainly not come now. The neighbors must have seen what happened, and they would have warned the men to stay far away from the house. Johanna looked out of the peephole in the door. One soldier was left standing on guard. "He will not leave a thing unturned, and if those riders are hidden here, we will find them," the German had also said. The riders were big, and there were 12 of them, and the horses too. What hiding place would be big enough? As she sat on the bottom step of the stairs, Johanna's mind wandered through the whole house, thinking of all the different closets, but not one was big enough to hide the riders safely. At last, she thought of her attic room. Of course, her own secret hiding place was there. It was certainly big enough, but it was right in Captain Braun's room. But the more she thought about it now, the more she became convinced that it would also be the safest place to hide the riders. The Germans would certainly not think that the riders might be hidden in the room of a German officer, and they would probably not search his room. Captain Braun apparently had not discovered the cubbyhole, and perhaps never would discover it. Anyhow, it was the only place in the house where she could hide the riders. She would leave them in the burlap sacks and push them all the way deep in. Tonight was Friday night, and Captain Braun was not home. If she worked fast, the riders would be hidden before he came back. Johanna ran upstairs and started to carry the sacks to the attic room. She didn't put a light on for fear the soldier on guard would see it and come to investigate. Instead, she took grandfather's flashlight. She decided to do the heavy work first and carry everything upstairs. Putting the riders in the cubbyhole would be easier. She decided also to take the radio from behind the books and put it in the cubbyhole too. It wasn't easy. By the time the last horse and rider were in the attic room, Johanna was out of breath. Her hair was mussed and her skirt was torn in several places. It had also taken her much longer than she had expected. But if she worked fast, there was still time enough before Captain Braun came home. In the closet, she pushed Captain Braun's uniforms aside and reached to open the bolt of the little door. But it had become stiff and rusty. She got down on her knees and tried again. The bolt didn't yield. Johanna felt warm and her hands started to tremble. Surely she would be able to open the bolt. It had never given her trouble before. But no matter how hard she tried, she could not open the bolt on the little door. She forgot everything around her, even the riders and grandfather and grandmother, and the danger they were in at this moment. She thought only of one thing. The door must open. It must. She was so busy she didn't hear the footsteps on the stairs or the door of the attic room opening. She first saw Captain Braun when he was standing in the door of the big closet. He had to bend down a little not to hit his head against the low ceiling. "What are you doing in the dark in my closet?" he asked. He switched the light on so that Johanna's eyes were blinded by it, and she turned her head away. Around her on the floor were the sacks with the riders. The radio was right beside her, and Johanna pushed it behind her back. But she couldn't hide the riders. Captain Braun kneeled down and opened one of the bags. There was nothing Johanna could do or say. He took out a white horse with gentle black eyes and a fierce curly mane. Then he opened the other bags. The little riders and their horses were lying helpless on their backs on the floor of the closet. The legs of the horses were bent as if they wanted to get up and gallop away. The riders looked more brave and proud than ever, but Johanna knew that no matter how brave and proud they looked, they were forever lost, and she could not save them anymore. Here's a picture. A feeling of reckless despair came over Johanna. Nothing that she would do or say now could make the situation any worse than it was already. She had tried hard, but she had failed. Grandfather and grandmother, and also the little riders, and even her father, whom she had promised to take care of the little riders. If it had not been for Captain Braun, she could have saved them. If he hadn't come home early, the riders would have been hidden, and grandfather and grandmother would have come back. Now she didn't know what the Germans might do to them. Everything she had ever felt against the Germans welled up suddenly in her. "I hate you and I despise you," she burst out. "And so does every decent person. And you'll never win the war. Grandfather says that you have already lost." She talked so fast that she had to take a deep breath before she could continue. And in a few months, there will be nothing left of Germany, grandmother says. You only have to listen every night to the airplanes that fly over. Then Johanna raised her eyes and looked at Captain Braun for the first time. With his boots and his uniform, he looked like all the other Germans. He looked the same as the soldiers who had taken away grandfather and grandmother. But his face was different. Captain Braun did not have a soldier's face. He had the face of a flute player. His face was unmoved, and except for a little heightened color, he appeared not even to have heard what Johanna had said to him. "So these are the famous little riders," he said quietly. He took one into the room and held it under the light. "They are much more beautiful than I was ever told." He looked again and hesitated for a little while. I would like to look at them much longer, but it would be safer for them and for you to put them back in the sacks and hide them where they will not be found." "But I can't," Johanna said. She wasn't feeling angry anymore, only frightened. "The bolt of the door is rusty. I can't open it." She was surprised to hear that she was crying. "And they took grandfather and grandmother. They said, if we find the riders in this house, you will see what happens to people who disobey an order given by a German officer." Captain Braun kneeled beside Johanna. His hands were strong and quick as he slipped aside the stiff bolt. He took the sacks and started to put the riders back in. "What will you do to them?" Johanna asked. "The little riders will be my guests for as long as they want to be," Captain Braun said. "I owe them that much. They are the first Dutchmen who looked at me in a friendly way and did not turn their faces away when I spoke to them." Johanna felt her face grow hot and red as he spoke. She bent down and started to help him put the riders and the horses back into the sacks. "There may not be much time," he said. "Crawl through the door and I will hand you the sacks." Johanna still hesitated. Was he really going to help her? "Come," he said. "Do as I tell you." There was a faint smile around his mouth, but the rest of his face looked grave. "This is an order given by a German officer." He gave her a gentle push. In a few minutes, the riders were hidden, and the radio too. At a moment when Captain Braun had his back turned, Johanna pushed it deep into the closet. One day when he was out, she would come and get it. Grandfather couldn't be without his radio. "Go down now," Captain Braun said. "It's better for all of us if no one sees us together." Johanna went downstairs, and alone she waited in the dark living room. Outside, the soldier was still standing guard. She pushed grandfather's big chair near the window and sat down, her tired arms leaning on the windowsill. From there, she saw them come across the marketplace. Grandfather had his arm around grandmother's shoulders as if to protect her from the soldiers who were all around them. This time there were more than 9. As soon as grandfather opened the door with his key, the soldiers swarmed over the room. The big red-faced soldier was again in charge. At his command, the others pushed aside the furniture and looked behind it. They stuck their bayonets into the upholstery and ripped it open, although Johanna couldn't understand why. The riders and the horses were much too big to be hidden in the upholstery of a chair. With their rifles, they knocked on the walls, and when grandmother's deft blue plates tumbled from the wall and broke in pieces, some of the soldiers laughed. When they left to search the upstairs, the room looked as if a tornado had passed through. Grandfather and grandmother went upstairs too, but they were always surrounded by soldiers, so that Johanna could not speak one word to them. All she could do was follow. The big red-faced soldier told grandfather to turn on the light, and while he fumbled clumsily to find the switch, the soldier pushed grandfather aside and turned the switch himself. In the soft glow of the lamp, the den looked immaculate. Johanna could hear grandmother give a little gasp of surprise. The soldiers began with the desk, taking out the drawers and dumping the contents in a heap on the floor. They went through all the papers. Now and then one of the soldiers went over to the red-faced man to let him read something. He always shook his head and shrugged his shoulders. At last, they went to the bookcase and began to take out the books. Johanna saw grandfather's face grow tight. She wished she could show him somehow that there was nothing to worry about. But there was always at least one soldier standing next to him and grandmother. The soldiers reached the shelf where the radio was always hidden, but there was only the books they kept dumping on the floor. Now they went down on their knees and looked under the bed and knocked on the wooden floor. Over their bent heads, grandfather looked at Johanna with more pride than she had ever before seen in his eyes. Grandmother gave Johanna a little wink. The soldiers finally gave up. They realized that there was nothing hidden in these rooms. Only the attic room was left. They climbed the last stairs. Johanna felt weak and shaky again. Even when they found Captain Braun, they might still decide to search the room. She was glad now that grandfather and grandmother had no idea where the riders were hidden. They walked confidently up the stairs, grandmother winking again at Johanna behind the soldiers' backs. The soldiers must not have known that the room was occupied by one of their own officers, because they were taken aback when they found Captain Braun with his legs on the table, writing in his music book. He rose from his chair. The soldiers apologized profusely, and the red-faced man especially seemed extremely upset at having intruded so unceremoniously in the room of a German officer. Captain Braun put all of them at ease with a few friendly words, and he must have made a joke, for they laughed. For one terrible moment, Johanna thought that after all, Captain Braun's face looked no different from all the other soldiers. What he had done tonight could be a trap, and he could betray them. But the soldiers now made ready to go, and they went without searching the room. Captain Braun swung his legs back onto the table and took up his pencil and music book. The attitude of the soldiers changed during their walk downstairs. When they came, they had been sure they would find the riders. Now they seemed uncertain. The big, red-faced soldier seemed to take it very much to heart that he had failed to find the riders, or even to find any evidence that grandfather had anything to do with their disappearance. He and the other soldiers seemed suddenly to be in a terrible hurry, and they left the house without saying a word, except for one young man with a pale complexion and fair hair, whom Johanna had hardly noticed before. He stopped on the doorstep to talk to grandfather. "We hope you understand, sir, that we only did our duty. Our duty is more important than the little inconvenience we caused you." His pale face started to glow now with enthusiasm, and he raised his right hand. "Hail Hitler!" he shouted as grandfather closed the door behind him. Grandfather picked up Johanna and swung her high as he had done when she was still a little girl. "Oh, Johanna, we are so proud of you. But where in this house did you hide the little riders? Grandmother hugged Johanna, but she wouldn't let her tell the secret until they were all sitting quietly with a warm drink. We will clean up the rooms tomorrow, Grandmother said, and she didn't even look at her deft blue plates. She could look only at Johanna. They talked till deep into the night, and both grandfather and grandmother went upstairs with Johanna to tuck her in and kiss her good night. Will they ever come back? Johanna asked grandfather. I don't think so, he said, as he sat down on the edge of her bed. They are convinced that the riders are not hidden here, and they can't prove that I ever had anything to do with their disappearance. He turned off the light and left the room. As Johanna lay thinking about everything that had happened during the long day, she could hear the airplanes flying over the house. The night was almost gone, and with the daylight, the planes were returning from their mission. Every night, it sounded as if there were more planes than the night before. This time, Johanna didn't think of her father. Instead, she thought of Captain Braun. She put on her slippers and walked upstairs. The door of the room stood ajar. Johanna pushed it open. Captain Braun was sitting at the table with his face buried in his hands. He looked up when he heard Johanna. I cannot sleep, Johanna said. If I leave my door open, would you please play the flute for me? And that was the end of chapter 4. I hope you're enjoying this story. And if you are, would you please pass the information along about my channel? I would love to see more subscribers, and be sure to click the bell so that you can get notification when I go live. So hopefully I will see you again tomorrow. We have chapter 5 and chapter 6 left. So not very much farther, only these pages right here. And then we'll have to pick another book to start. Okay, thanks for joining in, and we will see you tomorrow. Bye-bye.